Welcome back, and thanks for joining me for episode 4 of the series, The Fabric of a Revolution, Recreating a 13-Star American Flag. I'm Holly, a fiber artist and your host, and during the first half of 2026, I am undertaking a project to recreate a 13-star American flag while demonstrating the techniques available at the time of the American Revolution. I also want to use this project to investigate the people who would have been involved in these processes at this time in history. I'm getting pretty excited about this project as I can really see it starting to come together. In previous episodes, I have shown you how the wool from sheep and flax from the plant have been spun into threads. And in this episode, I will show you how we're going to weave those threads into cloth that will make our flag. The process of creating the type of cloth we need is called weaving. To weave a piece of cloth, you have threads lined up in one direction called the warp threads. These are often held in place by some kind of loom. Then you cross these warp threads with threads in a perpendicular direction called weft threads. They go over and under the first set of threads. The most basic way to organize these threads is to pass the weft over one, under one, over one, under one, etc. Then, on the next pass through, you again follow the over one, under one pattern, but you do it on the opposite threads as before. This creates a woven fabric. This over one, under one pattern is the most basic weave structure, called plain weave. But there are many ways to take this same concept and make a huge variety of cloth. In fact, back in the 18th century, you would routinely see ads like this one from the Boston Gazette, October 30th, 1775, listing a large variety of cloth like plains, serge, broadcloths, duffels, pompadour, many with names we no longer have in our current lexicon. Each of these fabrics would have a particular characteristic defined by its weave structure, material content, density, and even how the cloth was finished after weaving. With all these types of cloth having been made at the time period of the flag, how do we know what kind I will need to make? Let's look again at the fabric that makes up this historic flag that I am trying to recreate. Textile analysis of the original flag, performed by textile historian Dr. Rabbit Goody, states that the wool fabric pieces are of a type of cloth called bunting. It is woven in a plain weave structure with around 24 threads per inch. I know how thick those threads need to be from examining the flag in person, and I spent a good amount of time spinning those threads as I described in episodes 2 and 3. Knowing the thread count will help me set up my loom, so I can weave a piece of cloth comparable to that from which the original flag was made. Usually, to measure the warp threads, I would put my skein of thread on a tool called a swift, like this antique squirrel cage swift. It holds the skein and keeps it from getting tangled as I pull the thread out of the skein. Then I would use a warping board to measure the warp threads while keeping them under tension so they don't tangle. After measuring my warp threads, I would transfer them to the loom. Each thread is fed through the reed, then through these heddles. This allows me to control which threads rise up so I can pass my weft through. Each thread is then tied to the back of the loom. Finally, the warp threads are all wound on to the back side of the loom to store the warp and keep it under tension as I weave from the front. When weaving the linen for the stars, the hand-spun warp threads were rubbing together, making them a bit fuzzy, and they would stick to each other as they passed up and down. So for that cloth, I ended up using a purchased linen single for the warp and using my hand-spun for the weft. Now I'm going to show you how I wove the wool bunting. And while I do, I'll share some of what I learned about weaving around the time of the American Revolution. I want to start by looking specifically at bunting. In Grace Cooper's book, 13 Star Flags, Keys to Identification, the author says, although domestic manufacturers were privately encouraged, most people in the United States, like the government itself, continued to buy imported goods, especially if these were either better or cheaper or both. The manufacture of worsted fabric was well established in England. Although some woolen goods and worsted manufacture was carried on in the United States, bunting, a fabric of limited demand, was a highly specialized product and was noted in the account of the weaving at Sudbury. It was cheaper to buy British bunting than to attempt to manufacture the limited quantities of the fabric needed in America. I find this interesting. Before the Revolution, there was probably little need for bunting in the colonies. I'm guessing, and this is only a guess, that any flags for ships would have been supplied by the country whom the ship belonged to. And since colonists considered themselves subjects of the British Empire, that would have been England. However, once there was a need for a uniquely American flag, there would have been need for bunting with which to make them. As an aside, some of the early flags used during the earliest unrest in the colonies, like this one, were made of silk with designs painted on. But as for the stars and stripes, it seems that bunting was the fabric being used. Here is an advertisement from a maker of flags, also called colors, Rebecca Young, from 1781, asking, "Any person having bunting for sale may hear of a purchaser by applying as above." So, where did this Pennsylvania flag maker get her bunting? I suspect it was being made in America. If you look at the British shipping records from December 1779 through December 1780, you can see from this summary that no goods at all were exported from Britain to Pennsylvania, nor New England, nor New Providence. Could Rebecca Young have gotten bunting from other colonies that were still trading with England, like Carolina and New York? An examination of the shipping records for that year from London to Carolina show a great quantity of cloth being exported to Carolina, including dimity, fustians, cotton Welsh plains, different kinds of linens, silk in pieces, woolen goods, but no bunting. Unfortunately, I don't have records for New York from that year, but I suspect with the amount of weaving that was being done in America, someone could easily have made bunting here. There is plenty of evidence of weavers working in the colonies. There were home weavers who made cloth for use in their own homes and sometimes to sell. In a study of probate records from the 18th century, Dr. Laurel Ulrich found that the percentage of households that had looms varied, but they were present. In York County, Maine, 36% of the probate records she researched had looms, similar to New Hampshire and Hampshire County in Massachusetts at the time. It seems that for many of those families, the head of household did not identify as a weaver by trade, but she points out that based on diaries, letters, and account books from the time, ordinary household looms were producing such varied types of cloth as huckabuck, overshot, twill, diaper, dimity, fustian, jean, shirting, worsted, camblet, toweling, druglet, wale, and many patterns of coverlets and plain cloth. That is not to say there were no weavers by trade. Newspaper ads from professional weavers promoted the cloth made in their studios, like this ad from June 26, 1775. There were even weaving manufactories where work was still done by hand, but multiple weavers worked under one roof. In fact, the suit that George Washington wore when inaugurated as the first president of the United States was made from cloth woven at the Hartford woolen manufactory in Connecticut. Speaking of George Washington brings me to another group of people weaving in America at this time in history. George Washington had a plantation in Virginia called Mount Vernon. There, he enslaved over 500 people throughout his lifetime. These individuals grew crops like tobacco and wheat and performed domestic tasks like cleaning rooms, laundering clothes, preparing meals, and waiting on guests. Also at Mount Vernon, George Washington had a weaving workshop. The Library of Congress has a small journal in which he recorded the productivity of the weaving workshop from January 1767 to January 1771. The workshop was run by Thomas Davis, likely hired from England. The weavers worked in cotton, wool, linen, and silk, and produced a variety of weaves. According to the National Archives, in 1767, Davis and the enslaved weavers produced just over 1,500 yards of linen, wool, and cotton cloth of various sorts. Farther north, in Londonderry, New Hampshire, there was also an important weaving industry. In the early 1700s, Scotch-Irish immigrants came to New England to escape religious persecution, and with them they brought their knowledge, skills, and tools for making flax into linen. Some settled in Worcester, Massachusetts, some in Maine, and some in Nutfield, New Hampshire, later to be called Londonderry, New Hampshire. Some of these families employed themselves in the business of weaving linen. In 1731, there was note by the local New Hampshire government of persons traveling in Londonderry trying to sell foreign linens under the pretense that they were made in Londonderry, prompting them to design a seal with the name of the town on it and appoint a person to stamp all linen woven in Londonderry with the seal to mark it as authentic. At a meeting in 1748, the agenda said they were to choose a proper and fit person or persons to survey and inspect the linens and hollens made in this town for seal, that so the credit of our manufactures may be kept up, and the buyers and purchasers of our linens may not be imposed upon with foreign and outlandish linens in the name of ours, or any other method that may be thought proper and necessary for that end, as may be agreed upon. And the said sealers and inspectors shall seal any of the linens with a stamp in each end of the piece of cloth with the words Londonderry in New Hampshire, and give a certificate to the persons that are owners of the cloth. So, as I hope you can appreciate, a wide variety of wool and linen cloth was being produced here in America during the 18th century. Was the cloth used for the original 13-star flag made here? We'll likely never know, but I can be sure that the cloth of the reproduction was. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.